Hello, everyone, and welcome to 360 Feedback Practices Revealed, Insights from the 2022 Benchmark Study. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and introductions. I'm Jessie Bieringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group and the Study Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Joining me to discuss the results of our latest 360 study is 3D Group President Dr. Dale Rose. Before I introduce Dale, a few quick points. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation, and we'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end in a Q&A session. I'll also be distributing the electronic copy of the study at that time after Dale covers key data highlights. So a little bit about our speaker today. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focused post-360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. Now I'll hand it over to you, Dale, to get us started.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for joining today. I am excited to be here, excited to be releasing our 7th edition of this benchmarking study that we started 20 years ago, and really some interesting data. We've got some new questions that we're happy to share, and I just, anytime I'm talking through data like this, I love it. But this study in particular was one that started many years ago, actually 20 years ago, on a real basic question of, we would frequently get questions from prospective clients and clients about practices. Well, do people usually do this? Do people usually do that? And being a company that's grounded in data, our company name is Data Driven Decisions. We thought, well, we have opinions, we know what we do, but maybe we should actually do a broad survey and find out what really is going on from a current practices standpoint. So that's the genesis of this project, is really to try to share with folks what the current state of 360 is. I've written extensively on what we ought to be doing, but what are we actually doing? That's what I hope to reveal today. And so again, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to sharing some data and then answering questions as they come up in the end. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for quite a long time. The project has sort of evolved over the years. At the beginning, we really just did interviews. We interviewed all the participants in great detail. And we realized it was a little difficult to get folks, the scheduling, the time, et cetera. And we couldn't get as broad a questions. It took a lot longer to get the data. So we shifted to a survey-only mode, and that worked okay, but then we thought we were missing a little bit of the depth that we had in the interviews. So the last few editions, we've actually done the survey and then followed up with folks to really make sure we've got all the questions clear and correct, and in some cases some follow-up inquiry is relevant. So on to our seventh edition. Let me talk a little bit about the survey characteristics in terms of the participants. So the participants, pretty broad spectrum of companies, 18 different industries covered, large companies, small companies. You can see here, 40% or 1,000 employees or more, and some of them are actually quite large, but there's also almost a third that are real sort of smaller enterprises. And I think this distribution is actually encouraging in the sense that 360s clearly are a practice that are done and used by large corporations, but they're also adaptable to a smaller subset. I think about it as anywhere you have leadership, you ought to be able to have a 360. So pretty broad representative sample of companies that have responded. Mostly talent managers are giving our feedback. We're asking the questions of folks who are running the 360 practice in their organizations. So they've got real detailed knowledge, everything from How many questions are in your survey, what your rating scale is, all the way up to what does your CEO think of the program, things along those lines. So let me dive in. We started on kind of a broad level. The last project that we did, the last edition, we started asking questions about kind of the strategic evolution. This fit with our publication of the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. And we started looking at how strategic are the programs that we're seeing out there. And we looked at it in a couple of different ways. So we've got sort of this 5-bucket approach where we look at a user-driven approach where it's really just anybody in the organization can kind of do their own thing on a 360 without really even necessarily a lot of guidance, not super strategic, all the way up to a business-driven approach where it's part of the regular cycle of the organization. Every year leaders are getting feedback, or at least a regular rhythm, and it's used in a census way, in the sense that basically all leaders are getting feedback and then they're able to use those data for business-driven decision making, kind of the most strategic. We see in the last study, and again this study, that the least frequent approach is this user-driven approach, where it's just kind of a free-for-all without even really much guidance. And that's actually declined a little bit from the last time we did the study, which is, from our perspective, encouraging. It's good that people are getting feedback, but somehow the organizational involvement seems really, really important. Not surprisingly, human resource driven is really the most one of the most popular here in terms of companies. Putting some guardrails, some guidelines about how do you use 360, what's the instrument going to be, who gets copies of reports. So HR getting involved, again, we would wholeheartedly agree, is super important. And again, encouraging that a majority of companies involve HR at least in some capacity or other. The program-driven approach, kind of the next most popular, is really more around, you see this in like leadership programs. You've got a high potential program or first-time managers program, things along those lines, where a 360 is built into a curriculum that leaders are following, and so it's incorporated in. There's some really interesting work actually in this space around fitting content to the actual curriculum of the training program you've got. So again, very, very encouraging from a strategic standpoint that this is a very popular approach. And then the purpose-driven, which has really increased since last time we saw the data here, is more around, a particular initiative, a particular department is making some, organizational changes and wants to see what the capacity of their leaders are, things along those lines. So it's really part embedded within an episodic kind of a project where the data can be useful, presumably also useful at the individual level, but you're using it in addition at an aggregate level to understand a group of people. And then, of course, the most strategic, unfortunately, the least frequent is the business-driven, but not that surprising given the effort required, right? This is where 360s are just part of what the company's doing on a regular basis. It's an expectation as a leader that you're getting feedback on a rhythm, and it's just built into some of the decision models often used for talent reviews, succession planning, that sort of thing. So least frequent, I look at that as an opportunity. I think it's a real opportunity for organizations to expand their usage to a more strategic level, but I see it also as very encouraging that at minimum, that HR-driven, sort of program-driven process is certainly the more popular approach. So some room to grow here, but an interesting way to think about the way 360s are used. You'll notice, of course, this doesn't add up to 100. It's not which one. We saw many companies using multiple different purposes. They might have a program-driven leadership program they're running people through, but they also just let people do it whenever they want. One of the other things we see in the data here is there are fewer uses, right? So the total is actually less than it was the last time we did it. So there may be companies that are doing it a little bit less in multiple different modalities, if you will. Well, if you're starting out a 360 process, you're trying to launch one of the first things you've got to ask yourself is, where's the support? Who wants this? So one of the questions we ask is, how supportive is senior leadership? And we've seen over the years that by and large, senior leadership has been very supportive of 360s. They see it as value add, and it's been very consistent across the years. Well, this particular study, we were interested in this question and trying to kind of expand it out a little bit to say, well, what is senior leadership? And it's good to have senior leadership support, but at what levels and in what parts of the organization we thought would be an interesting dive. And then also, maybe breaking apart a little bit how supportive they are. So this was one of the newer questions where we started asking the different levels. And we found some surprising and also unsurprising results. The CHRO is the most supportive senior leader, being the greatest advocate and also clearly supportive at minimum, but well over half are really strong advocates, along with the chief learning officer. So this makes sense in the sense that the content is in their purview, so to speak. But super encouraging is that 78% of CEOs were supportive of the 360 process. So it's great to see that the value of this process actually goes all the way up through the organization. That may very well be because the CEO themselves are using a consumer of the data, possibly even getting feedback themselves. But again, super encouraging. Not super surprising that the CFO, it drops off a little bit there, but still very encouraging. And then the least supportive, if you will, were frontline managers. And I think there's a real opportunity here. I mean, again, I think what this tells us, if anything, is that there tends to be a little bit of a tilt toward more senior leadership usage and value. Obviously, again, a strong majority of the frontline leaders still do support the process, but I think making sure that we're building processes that are value added for frontline leaders and they see it as a value add for their work is again an opportunity for us. But by and large, very encouraging that at the senior levels around that table, there's a real strong endorsement of the value that 360 brings to the company. So yeah, nice to be able to piece that apart a little bit. We also ask a little, we ask questions around kind of what's essential, like what is the essence, if you will, of 360 feedback? What are the key components that if I'm starting out doing a 360 process, or I really want to level up my process, I have to make sure these components are built in at the get-go. So the kind of the meat and potatoes, the essential ingredients, the staples, if you will, of 360 feedback. Clearly, anonymity, which was number one last year. You can see the little numbers here. I can kind of probably highlight these little numbers here, indicate what rank the feature was in the prior study, just to give a sense of how much they're moving around. The number 1 and 2 were that anonymity of raters, but interestingly, also that one-on-one feedback, debrief, and coaching. And we'll see some more data on this later, but it seems that aspect of receiving 360 is just critical to the process as a whole. And then, of course, the open-ended comments we hear all the time, how much people value those. There's some very interesting data we'll see in a minute around the actual increase in quantitative results. But that easy to read report, there's nothing like receiving feedback. Leaders can get very nervous, it can be very emotional, and then if you can't understand what you're reading, very, very terrifying. So I think that there's some wisdom in this easy to read report. I'd love to see personally these numerical results go up a little bit. I think there's some real value in that. I could go at length on that topic, but certainly some encouraging data here. And then, of course, let's not forget the importance of non-HR business leaders supporting the tool. Now, important but not as important are these components. You can see that the idea of looking at group level data, that kind of strategic focus we were talking about before, is a little bit less popular. Interestingly, and again, we'll get some more data on this, mobile access to surveys, by over a third, but not critical. And so, some interesting results in here. I think the formal orientation is one to kind of think about. Is it as important for raters? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly for participants, it's something worth considering, making sure you've got alignment of expectations. But in any case, anonymity does seem to be the absolute crux, along with getting feedback support, so people can really translate their feedback and turn it into meaningful actions and behaviors. Let's not overlook, interestingly, I think it is, so this is an interesting one too, the well-researched or developed survey content, right? What questions do you ask? Almost 70% saying it's essential to get that right. Well, we did a little bit of a deep dive into length of survey, which is actually shifted over the years. So in terms of just how many questions should be on the survey, everybody, I think, not a lot of people enjoy filling out super long surveys, but there's been some experimentation. You can see here back in 2016, lots of experimentation going on in 2016 with some really short surveys, right? Like less than 20 questions. How can we make this fast and easy? Lots of organizations are looking for faster and easier ways of doing these things. What we've seen, though, is lately a shift to much longer surveys. That's not quite where it was back when we started, where surveys could have been as long as 120, 130 items. So we don't see that quite as often, but we do see that it's kind of balanced out a little bit. If you look at the averages, we end up with an average length of about 52 items. So if you're trying to cover the domain of leadership, which is extremely complex, it makes sense that you're not going to be able to do this in 10 questions. You're going to be able to get kind of a global view of somebody, but you're not going to be able to get that depth and detail that is really necessary to craft development goals and shift leader behavior. Someone might get a sense of kind of a report card of it. How am I doing? Good, bad, ugly, whatever. Pardon me. But you're not going to get the detail and the subtlety that you might need to really craft a plan to develop as a leader and take that next step in your growth. So slightly longer surveys tends to be the trend, but I wouldn't call them long at 50 items, again, if they're written well enough. So how do you fill those surveys out? What does the technology look like? We've seen some very interesting trends over the years. I think this is one of the data points where the longevity of our data really do tell an interesting story. So how do you complete the survey? Well, 20 years ago, fully 10% only offered surveys on paper. So this paper only here, 10% of companies only providing surveys in that format. And then, only 41% internet only. That's obviously well more than doubled at 96%. So, not a big surprise. The efficiency, the accuracy, the convenience, it all makes sense. But interestingly, paper is not completely dead. 4% of companies allow both methodologies. We've certainly seen this as a need in certain organizations. I know of a bakery, for example, that on the bakery floor, their workers don't have the mobile technology or the internet access, and they just want to do it on paper. It's one and done. They give people a quick break. They fill out their surveys, and pop it in the envelope. So obviously not a growing trend, but it has not disappeared completely. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, you think about the mobile device and internet connected in that way. We've seen a little bit of shift in the last couple of years, where the mobile device is not the only way that folks are completing surveys. It's really more about both PC and mobile. So mobile was less critical 3 years ago, and even in the last 3 years, it's really spiked quite a bit. So it's that sort of mobile optimized survey platform becomes a critical feature to include. And clearly one that companies are valuing. I'd like to think that doesn't mean people are filling surveys out while they're waiting to order coffee at the coffee shop, but hopefully they're putting a little more attention and care into it. And then the question of how surveys are reported and generated also has shifted a bit. If we look back, over the years, that desktop specific software seems to be far less common. and the automated online reporting is really, again, jumped in there as the primary methodology, really for completing surveys. But this desktop office software, the idea that someone's using an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, almost 20% of companies were doing that back in 2013, and it's almost completely dropped off. So again, not super surprising, but interesting to see that it really has shifted in a way. And so if you happen to be the 1% out there that's trying to tabulate paper-based surveys in your Excel spreadsheets, recommend that you look out there for some web-enabled tools that can make it a lot more efficient. Many benefits to that. Great. So I mentioned before about the data itself, and when you sit across the table with a leader and they're looking at their report and you ask them what they see in it. In fact, this actually literally just happened to me yesterday. The first thing most of them will say is, well, I looked at it. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed the comments. They were really helpful. So comments are valuable, nothing wrong with them. But an interesting trend we're seeing is actually in another direction, in the sense that while those comments are valuable, the quantitative data in the reports is actually on the rise quite a bit, in the sense that each one of these different components, and I'll give you a little time to process some of these items, but each one of the components within a report, which is really what I'm getting at here, that are quantitative primarily, are on the rise. So each one of these is increasing, the only exception being the use of standard deviation in variability displays. So I think there is some sense that the way that data are being presented is actually, there are some benefits to presenting quantitative data, hopefully in ways that are a little bit more easy to digest. I guess that standard deviation one being less frequent. I think there's a little bit of a drop off here in the sorted item results and then sorted competency results. But again, I think ways to display, so the graphical display of variability is a little easier to digest. A simple frequency distribution, how many ones, how many twos, how many threes, can be a very powerful way just to display the data, where somebody can understand it without having to kind of process things like, is there a statistically significant difference between these average scores and that sort of thing. So encouraging for me that the data are being used, the quantitative data in particular. The other thing that's really important to recognize about quantitative data is, unlike comments, which again, no hate on comments, but they're augment, I think, the quantitative data. The one thing that's great about quantitative data is you're able to compare, like everyone rates that item, right? So if you've got an item like, say, follows through and commitments, everyone provides their feedback on that. And so you get kind of a census view of how you're seen that way. But when you look at open-ended comments, people may or may not have commented on that item, that issue. They just commented on what jumped into their mind. And so it's sort of a standout from one individual versus, hey, it's actually really important to consider this leadership behavior that no one else really considered, and how everyone sees you. So you get a census across the people, and you get a more comprehensive assessment if you have 52, for example, behaviors that you're looking at across the spectrum of leadership. So I think this is really encouraging from a best practice standpoint, that we're seeing an increase in each of these different components. Of course, the anonymity piece is the highlight in terms of one of those essential components. Well, why is anonymity so important? Because it illustrates the credibility in the data. If people know who said what, it's harder to trust. We know that when people face-to-face have a hard time giving tough feedback in an anonymous environment where their identity is protected, they're going to be more willing to share feedback that might be a little harder, even data that they might not share at all in person. So one of the key elements to that is who provides the feedback and how you display that in the report. And again, I literally just ran into this problem yesterday. Couple options. So, when you put that report out, do you include the names of exactly, who was invited? or do you include the names of who responded, or do you just leave it numbers? You know, you got 5 peers that responded, you got 3 direct reports that responded. A third of companies don't list the names. The challenge with that is if I'm looking at the data for myself as a leader and I'm trying to understand, well, what should I, well, I'll use my example, follows through commitments. Gee, my peers say I don't follow through on commitments, or at least 5 of them do, but I don't know which 5 they are, and I invited 10, and so maybe it's the wrong 5, and all of a sudden I have a reason to ignore the data. You've given me a really great reason to just, I don't really know who this is, so I'm not going to bother. Now, if I at least know who was invited, I know the list, and I'm reminded, oh yeah, it was those peers, and it was like 8 of the 10, then I might have a little bit more motivation. But the thing that really works best is if I know exactly who responded. Now, I don't know who said what. I don't know exactly whether Bob gave me a 2 or a 3 on follow through commitments. But if I at least know that, you know, of my, say, 5 direct reports, the 3 who replied did not include my 2 poor performers, that my 2 poor performers actually didn't respond, then my data I know are coming from my superstars and I can weigh it appropriately. So again, there are ways to protect the anonymity, but from my point of view, the 12% down here, I'm cheering you on, and I want to see that number continue to grow because I've seen it again and again. And this is where behavior can really change, and where people who are trying to ignore their feedback or move beyond it tend to find an excuse and a way around it. Decision making. So there's been a debate raging for decades now, literally, about should 360 feedback be used solely for development, or should it be used for decision making? Now, a good friend of mine, Dave Bracken, has written extensively on this, even wrote a piece called What is a Decision, where he unpacks the very details of it. And he makes a great point that, you know, decisions that get made on 360 feedback, there are decisions being made, there are development decisions being made, there are training decisions being made, there are promotion decisions being made. But we look at specifically, okay, what kind of decision making is made using 360 feedback? And unfortunately, I'm pretty confident that Dave would be somewhat disappointed in the findings that we've got here, but data are data. His point of view is that you ought to be able to use the data for more personnel decisions, that it's super powerful data and should be used in that capacity. Unfortunately, and he would say also for development. He would not say only for decision making in personnel kinds of promotions, et cetera, but for also for development. We don't see that just personnel decisions only as the primary usage. It's been very low for a long time, and in this sample it was literally none. Using it for both development and personnel type decisions, these kind of promotion, you know, pay decisions, bonuses, that kind of thing, about a quarter of companies, or I guess about a fifth, if I'm going to round, about a fifth of companies are using 360s for both. But clearly development is the center of what people are using 360s for. You know, almost 40%. This has been kind of the Center for Creative Leadership position for a long time, that the person owns the feedback themselves, do with it what they want. It seems like that does seem to be a pretty common approach. Although, you know, I think the idea that it's also being used for important development planning decisions. You know, if you look at succession planning, for example, or annual development goals, this is involving somebody's manager with their feedback, and saying, hey, how can you use the feedback for that purpose? So, you know, I think that the debate is not really a debate. It's not an either or, it's really a blend, and how do we use it well is really the question. But it does seem that development has to kind of be there. And when we drill down even a little further into some of these details, we find that it's pretty consistent. So again, if we try to really parse them out into, you know, succession planning, about a fifth. For performance management, there's also a great chapter in our book by the Campions, actually, brother, sister, and father, on how best to do through performance management with a 360 process. So these kind of blue areas down here are more of those sort of personnel decisions, kind of, are we moving people up in the organization? Are we promoting them? Are we giving them more resources? Even, you know, we've even tried to get at like an indirect link talent review kind of stuff. But really, people are saying clearly the core of it up here is development, development broadly, career development, and then even this link to training, which again, I'll reiterate the Conjure chapter in our book gets at how that can be done extremely well in terms of literally linking the content to your curriculum. I'm hoping that might be a part of the rise that we're seeing here. But yeah, again, development seems to be the core. But again, it's not that companies are including these data in their succession planning conversations and their talent reviews. It just tends to be a little bit less prevalent. Now, I promised I'd mention a little bit more about the importance. We talked about one-on-one feedback coaching being an essential component. Well, we found actually that it's even a bigger increase than we anticipated. We've seen this consistently over the years. We've asked this question from the very first time we did the study in 2002, and we've seen that this has been, that one-on-one feedback session has been an important component, really, for the entire time. But boy, is it big now. 88% of companies seeing that feedback session as essential. Now, I want to emphasize that these feedback sessions, and I don't know in detail for all 88% of them, but they really ought to be a lot more than reading through a report. You ought to be able to, that clear report that we talked about, prior, the data ought to be understandable in the report, but what do I do with it? How do I put it in context? How do I deal with this group of directs that are giving me this feedback? My favorite example is, gee, my direct reports are telling me I'm micromanaging. That's probably horrible, right? Well, coach is going to push back and say, well, I don't know. Are they poor performers that need micromanaging, or are they superstars that you should give autonomy to? Context matters. So real coaching in this is what ought to be happening, more so than just a read through the report. But either way, I think the message is pretty clear that finding a way to get that support around using the feedback is a critical component that people are seeing as essential to their program. Interestingly, the way coaching is being delivered has changed quite a bit. I think you'll probably recognize some of why that is in a moment. But one of the choices you've got, of course, is, well, who is it that's going to give this coaching feedback session to each leader? And of course, one of the questions companies have is, should I have that be an internal person, or should I have that be an external person? What we've seen, and it's a little bit of a shift, is that a majority of companies are a larger percent are involving external coaches in that conversation. Now, about a fifth do both, right? So there's some overlap here, where for some people they're getting an external coach, for some people they're getting an internal coach, which I think does make some sense. I often say, the CFO really shouldn't be getting coached by the CHRO on their feedback, like their peers. Can be a very awkward conversation to be in. CHRO ought to have the opportunity to be a real feedback provider and not facilitate that conversation. So there are certain cases where it ought to be, really ought to be an external person. And it seems as though there's been some decision making here around maybe including externals more, but not dismissing the internal coach as an option. I think internal coaching can be a really great way to build up your HR managers. One caution I would give briefly is make sure they're capable and make sure they do it frequently. I think the quality of that coaching is something you've really got to assess, because it is so central to the process. You want to make sure you're not losing people on sort of weak or inexperienced coaches. Isn't going to encourage development for the leaders who are getting feedback. Now, the big shift that I did talk about is the way that coaching is given. Used to be in person pretty ubiquitously, right? I mean, in person was really the way to do it. Yeah, okay, we'll tolerate by phone. We'll do that some of the time. But companies now are saying, you know what, that video call works just fine. Again, not a surprising shift given the recent shift in the workplace toward using video as much more common than it was in 2016, where it was quite rare. So it seems that the good news here is that you can do a lot more efficiently. I think probably cost is another factor here, and I think people have recognized that the quality of the coaching is going to be just as good. Obviously, if you're doing an executive coaching experience, something along those lines, it might shift a little bit, but it seems that what's the old song? Video killed the radio star. Well, I guess video killed the flying consultant. Okay, so another new question that we asked this go around, we were interested in business impact, and we've seen organizations ask questions around business impact of 360 quite a bit. So we asked a couple of questions on business impact. The first was, what are the kind of metrics? What are the things that you think 360s are impacting from a business standpoint that are valuable to the business in an economic sense? So we looked at employee turnover, retaining high potentials, customer satisfaction, or maybe just better decision-making by leaders, which clearly should have a positive business impact. The two standouts were clearly around retaining high potentials and then leaders making better decisions. Not that the other two weren't prevalent and a quarter of the companies seeing that benefit, but it's interesting that these two really stood out. That just simply having a leader receive feedback from employees, we know the blind spots show up all the time, so they're able to see things they didn't see before, undoubtedly make better decisions about how they can be more effective leaders, better organizations, better business impact. So encouraging to see that these are two that really stood out for a lot of folks. The other one, we hear quite frequently requests for, hey, do you have any ROI data on your 360 process? I've done a couple ROI studies. I can tell you they're incredibly complex. It's very challenging to get the kind of data that you want. And you can often end up with really unrealistic estimates, and so it's a tricky thing to get right and to do well, particularly with widely varying implementations. The way one person does a 360 process is going to be radically different than the way another one does, and so generalizing ROI from one implementation to the next, I think, is pretty challenging. But that's my opinion as a professional. What's actually going on out there is the interesting question. What we found is that there are 5% of companies that have actually done a rigorous ROI analysis. So it's non-zero. It's not that no one has ever done it, but boy, is it infrequent. And to the point where even 20% we're like, I'm not even sure if we have or haven't. So it seems that while there's sort of a desire for this answer, it may not be such a strong desire that companies are taking the time and effort to go into that and actually do the work to do a real ROI study. We went further to say, okay, well, if you haven't, then why haven't you? And the predominant answer was no one asked for it. So if I'm interpreting this and trying to make sense of it, I guess I would say it seems as though, if I go back to the support, if you've got 78% of CEOs, supporting or even being a strong advocate for the process, it may be that they recognize the value intrinsically. Maybe they've experienced it themselves. They've used it as a to evaluate some of their leaders, and they may see the value without needing to see it in the numbers. Again, we saw the CFO was a little bit lower. Maybe they're a little bit more skeptical, when any good CFO should be a little skeptical. But it seems that for the most part, when it comes to ROI, there are some folks who are asking, but very few, and there are very few who have actually gone to the length of really digging in to do that ROI analysis. And I would love to see copies of those 5 folks' ROI results. My guess is that they're likely to want to keep them to themselves, but it does seem that there's sort of an understood value, whether or not they've actually gone to the length of documenting it and getting it down to a % ROI. That seems to be less frequent. And then we often ask also, we've asked, I think, almost every year, well, what does the future look like of 360 feedback? Do you see it as something that is, core to what you're doing and it's going to keep going, or was it sort of a thing you dabbled with and, oh, that was interesting, now let's move on to the next fad, if you will. The short version of this is that the future is fairly bright. We see, 3/4 of companies saying they're going to give employees more feedback or the same as they gave this year. In fact, about a third see it as growing in terms of the number of leaders they'd like to get feedback. And then indeed about a fifth of companies feel like they see their budget increasing to do more. It's of course always funny when you've got 30% saying they want to do more leaders and only 20% saying the budget's going to go up. But that's for companies to sort through in their budgeting and implementation processes. So very encouraging data here. I will say I have covered probably about a third of all the data points in the full study. I think many of the highlights and certainly most of the new items in there. The report itself includes, as you've seen with these different graphics, data across the entire 20-year spectrum. So there's data in there, not just from the most recent year, but you can really see good, trend lines here in terms of people's confidence around various aspects of the process. So I encourage you to take a look at it in depth and in detail. But for the moment, these are the data that I have to present here. I do want to leave some time, I think I've done that, for questions if any emerge during the presentation here. And then also I know there were a couple from during the registration process. So Jesse, do we have any questions that I can answer that I haven't covered already?
We do. We have some really good questions here, but we have a little bit of time. So if you have a burning question, feel free to ask. You can either write it into chat or you could raise your hand and I can unmute you. The first one I've got here, I think you've covered this a little bit, but what do you see as the major missed opportunities in terms of how 360s are being designed currently?
Yeah, I would say broadly, the biggest opportunity is around systemic or strategic usage, right? I think there's a tendency to look at 360s as opportunities for individual growth and development, and unquestionably they are that. There is also an opportunity to look at the data from a systemic standpoint, and if you could look at an aggregate, and not even just an aggregate, but patterns of scores and data across your organization. I think there's some training needs opportunities that can be discussed. There can be some cultural things that can shift. So I think doing more of a census participation where you've got, like, for example, all leaders within a department, and then be able to look at those group-wide trends and at the senior level discuss what's going on in our population from a leadership standpoint. There's a lot of opportunity there, and we saw again some of the data showing some strategic uses out there happening, but they could be much bigger. I think there's some great opportunity to get in and sort of show the value of what you can do when you look at group level data, and then look at patterns in the data as well.
So Kent just wrote in, we've got our frontline supervisors are worried that their direct reports will use 360s to retaliate for their perceived slights. Is this a valid fear?
In short, no. I mean, yes, it's a valid fear, right? I'm not gonna discount somebody's emotional state, right? And I think in some cases there can be cultures that, company cultures that are perhaps encouraging of that, but we just don't see it happen very often, because at the end of the day, it's clear that the data, while we don't go back with, like, Bob said this, Joe said that, Jane said the other thing, the data of who said what aren't available. It just doesn't really play itself out very well if people are being vindictive. It's like, here's my chance. This isn't Twitter, right? Like, this is a company sponsored survey that HR is involved in, and people kind of recognize there's a certain level of responsibility. I think this is also where rater training can come in. And on some level, raters should be held accountable for the accuracy and quality of their feedback. I think that's absolutely important. I think it's important to express to people the seriousness of it. And I think I've not seen a lot of retribution at all. Again, with the caveat that some companies, but then you've got a chance to work on the culture and trust. And in those environments, you really need to just spend a little more time on orientation, right? You need to introduce the process to the participants receiving the feedback and to raters. We did a process like this with a company. It was actually an Asian headquartered company that where there was real fear. It was again culturally for them in the country. There was this sort of like, how could I give feedback to my direct manager? Like the direct manager is always right, was sort of their orientation. And so it was a little tricky for them. And I literally, in a meeting with like 300 people, had to like have people raise their hands if they were receiving feedback and then tell them to leave the room, and then talk to the remaining people and say, look, we're not giving up your identity. You need to be honest, but be constructive. And so I think working through those trust issues during an orientation is the way to get through it. But I haven't seen it really show up where people are really, if anything, they'll withhold, but they'll rarely be vindictive.
Some great questions here coming in. What do you see? Michael asks, what do you see currently in the future in terms of frequency of 360 feedback? Some platforms are utilizing anonymous feedback all the time versus a structured point in time assessment. And then sort of related to that, it used to be standard to conduct 360 feedback every 2 or at most every year. Is there a tendency to conduct feedback more frequently in the US and to use shorter questionnaires for this purpose? Do it every 3 months.
Yeah, so these get at kind of two related questions, so I'll answer them kind of together. So we've got some data on how frequently people use 360s. Short version of that is every other year is more common than every year, but the two of those are kind of the most common. I actually wrote a chapter 25 in our book on the comparing 360 feedback to other, I call them alternate forms of feedback, these sort of continuous feedback apps and things like that. And so I've gone into depth in there, and I recommend you check out that chapter because it really does kind of parse the different kinds of alternate forms of feedback and how they compare and why in a pretty systematic way. But I can give you the kind of the highlight, which is we've not seen, so there's a real difference between a systematic look at your leadership and a step back to plan how you're going to develop across the spectrum of behaviors that are required for leadership, which can't be covered in like 1 or 2 items and won't show up in an open-ended field. People won't capture, how well do you link or corporate strategy to your work unit activities? Like that's not going to show up in a comment. I mean, it might, but it's unusual. So I think recognizing that these two methods are very different, that a 360 feedback is a process, is an in-depth look at your leadership and an opportunity to really plan, going forward on an arc of development as a leader that should progress your career. That's very different than sort of these, little feedback messages. Secondly, I've looked now at, I think, 9 different case studies of those sort of continuous feedback apps. And I have not found one that's been super successful. Those tend to all grow out of the employee recognition space, kind of the attaboys and things like that, which are great. There's nothing wrong with that. I think, it's great to do that. We need more of that in our culture. But to see, what we find is those apps tend to be just that. They tend to be, wow, that was a great presentation. Wow, thanks for recognizing me or whatever. And those are good. It's just that they're not the kind of critical thinking around what do I really need from my leader, and it isn't as comprehensive. So I just see them as separate things. And again, that chapter really parses it in a pretty detailed way. So yeah, separate, different. I would say at least every other year for a leader. I think every year is better for a feedback process, but because yeah, I could go on at that, but at minimum, I would say every other year, and the data seems to support that as the kind of the most common.
Great, thanks, Dale. And you can see in a couple minutes when we give you the study and you can download it and take a look, you can see some more detail about how that's looked over time too. So the next one is, what type of development actions typically emerge from the feedback? What do you see, I guess, as a coach?
Yeah, sure. Well, and again, looking also across the data. So if you're doing a system-wide implementation, one of the things you can do is you can aggregate up what are all the development goals that emerged from this process. Like, I don't need to see scores. I need to know what are leaders developing. And you can actually look at that across the organization. And that's a valuable system-wide piece of data to feed back up through the organization to see what are our leaders developing and working on, where are their challenges, where are their strengths. I would say that it's quite varied, the data, and it's part of it is that it's very contextual, right? So you know, I can think of a leader I worked with recently where he was receiving feedback that he was not sharing information, like his direct report, it was all spread out. So like some of his direct reports gave him really low scores, some of them gave him really high scores on things like being supportive, giving challenging assignments and supporting them through it, sharing information as needed, developing them and coaching them, mentoring them, things like that. And then when I talked to him, he said, yeah, we're about to do a big, huge reorganization. And I've got like this group of people that I know I'm going to tuck under other people and are not going to report to me anymore. I've got a span of control of 14 people, so I can't really give them the attention I want, but I'm working on it. I've got a plan. We're gonna fix this, completely make sense of the data. So, you know, there's an example where it's very contextual what the data are. But often, you know, you see often things around, you know, what employees typically want. You know, they want autonomy to do the work, and they want support when they need the support because the autonomy was too much or it's more challenging. I think, you know, so that sort of delegation bucket tends to be pretty frequent. A lot of times, again, depends on level. You see a lot of stuff around vision, make the vision more clear, give us metrics on how we get there. It's really varied. I mean, yeah, there probably is some trends. I mean, there might be 15 or so most common dimensions. Maybe there's a paper in the future on this, but it's really quite varied. My experience, though, is that it tends to be very high impact. That people tend to, when they look at the feedback, it's very eye-opening. Or confirming, which is useful. It's like, okay, this is exactly what I thought was going on. So my plan is on target versus I wasn't really sure. So yeah, hopefully, like I said, it's a lot of options there.
So I got several questions. I'll try to sort of pull them together around bias in 360 feedback. So in general, what prevents bias in 360 feedback results? Tony wrote in, are there any changes or updates regarding gender bias in 360 feedback? And we also had a question about, given hybrid and work from home models, is there any data on, you know, bias towards feedbacks who are people who are remote or hybrid? So a couple different questions around bias.
Great. Let's see. So I'll hit the core concept of bias a little bit. So Walt Tornow in '92 wrote a great article that basically said bias is what you're looking for, right? That like I mean, bias, right? Bias in the sense of inaccurate, no, but bias is in understanding someone's bias, their personal point of view, the way they see the world. Is kind of the point. And it may be, just to use my examples before, that the bias is what's valuable. So, you know, I'm rating somebody as a 1 on sharing information as needed by others. Well, that's my point of view. That's exactly what's happening. Someone else is giving them a 5. Both of those are accurate, right? There's no bias in that. It's here's what my experience is. So I think that's one thing to be a little careful with, is to recognize what you're trying to do is capture people's perspective and help a leader understand it so they can adjust their behavior accordingly, and align their own assumptions about the way they're behaving, right? Now, so I think in general, I would say that you're trying to capture that, and that there isn't in that context what we would refer to as bias. It's accurately capturing different points of view. Now, gender bias is interesting. There is some stuff that's been written around. I'm not, the name of the author's not coming to me right now, but around the fact that women tend to get feedback that is a little bit more oriented toward the way they interact with others and sort of being collegial, if you will. And then men tend to get feedback about how they should do that better and how they can do it better and they wish they would do it better. And that men tend to get feedback more around, actually, I'm sorry, I've got this reversed, that men do not do that. And that women need to be more strategic and more decisive and that sort of thing, which is nonsensical that there would be any gender difference there per se. So there does tend to be a little bit of, it seems to be that the raters may treat women a little bit differently in terms of their expectations, that they be more decisive and be more demonstrative, and that men need to sort of tone it down a little bit more. So we do see a little bit of pattern there. It's not a huge shift, but there is some sense that there may be some difference in the way female leaders are seen and what their development areas are versus the way men are seen. And I would say this is something that any good coach would recognize and be able to bring into the conversation. So again, one of the real important aspects of including that real coaching experience in that feedback session.
Great, thank you, Dalen. Lots of wonderful questions are coming in here. We are about to run out of time, so I just want to let you all know I dropped the copy of the study in the chat if you want to go ahead and download it from chat, just in case anyone has to hop off right at time. I know people have meetings.
You know, I can do this all day long, right?
I know you can. And if for some reason you have an issue, you can follow up with us and we'll make sure everybody gets a copy, but I just wanted to make sure in case people had to hop. So Martin asked, have you done any analysis regarding the benefits of a candidate selecting who provides their feedback versus a random selection, and also kind of related to bias?
Yeah, so this is similar. I don't know of any like data on the differences, but we've got enough sort of experience ourselves to see this. You know, what we see and what all of our coaches have kind of reported is that when people choose their own raters, they kind of take one of two paths. They either authentically use it as an opportunity to go, these are people I really need to understand their point of view. And that's usually someone who's been through the process before and recognizes the value of it. And so they either take that approach of like, I got to use this as a tool to help me and I need feedback from these people, or they go I'm just going to pick my friends and family and see if I can get some good results. When they go that route, they get the feedback, they're always disappointed because they realize they missed a huge opportunity to understand the truth of what people think, which they can't get directly, which is one of the key values. One of the things we strongly recommend, and we do see, and there are some data in the report about how frequently this happens. I don't remember the exact results right now, but
I think it's 48% of people do the manager approval.
Thank you. So Jesse, where I was going here, includes some sort of an approver. So if you know your manager is going to look at the list and approve those raters, you're not going to go with the friends and family plan because your manager is going to straighten you out. So that's usually what we recommend, is some sort of approval. It also engages the manager. The manager should be involved in your development. So it should be, it's a great way to engage them up front. We definitely recommend manager approval as a key way to you know, increase accuracy.
And just one last question here. We talked about the fact that the data are showing more development versus decision making. So why aren't companies using it for decision making? What do you think is going on there with that trend?
Well, they're not listening to Dave Brackett enough. I don't know what to tell you there. I mean, I guess, you know, part of it has to do with the fear that people will change their ratings if they know that someone's going to get a raise. They don't want to be the bad guy, and so they're gonna go ahead and provide you know, inflated ratings just because, you know, they don't want to be the bad guy in that conversation. You know, I don't know. The data aren't necessarily super clear that that's what goes on. I think you know, there might be a bit of a concern that like this is people's perceptions and can we really use it to make those decisions? There's plenty of cases that have illustrated that you absolutely can. That's one of the more accurate ways to determine performance. Again, that chapter from the Campion's incredible around how to use it for performance management, which is clearly decision making. You know, there's also, you know, I will say the Center for Creative Leadership has been pushing the self-only, it's your feedback for a long time, and making that case. I know they've recently started, my friend John has said they've recently started to shift that a little bit, be more a little bit more flexible about who owns the report. But there's a long history of a whole camp of people saying it's only for development, it's only for development. So it may just be branding in that context. But I can tell you, if you look at some of the work that Alan Church has done around using 360s for talent management, man, it can be done really, really well. So education is a big part of it. Having experts in companies that know how to do it and follow those best practices, you know, that's another aspect. I do think it's an overlooked opportunity. I think 360s absolutely can be done, used for both development and talent decisions. No question. I've seen it done again and again and again. But it's admittedly, it's a tough hill to climb, apparently.
Well, thanks, Dale, and thank you all for joining us today. If you'd like a hard copy of the study, it's now available for purchase on Amazon. Your colleagues can request an electronic copy through us. So thank you all again and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.